Hatred isn't always loud or dramatic. It rarely announces itself with shouting or open confrontation. More often it arrives quietly, dressed in courtesy, wrapped in politeness, hiding behind smiles that seem harmless at first glance. This is what makes it so dangerous. Real hatred doesn't rush. It observes, it studies, it waits for the right moment to move, and by the time it does, the damage is already in motion. Careers begin to stall without explanation. Relationships feel strained for reasons you can't quite name, and you find yourself doubting your own perceptions instead of questioning the person who has been quietly working against you. Stoic philosophy teaches us that clarity is a form of protection, and without it, even the strongest mind can be slowly eroded from the inside. The first unmistakable sign of genuine hatred is this: they actively work against your success. Not openly, not in a way that invites confrontation, but subtly, patiently, and with intent. These are not people who simply disagree with you. Disagreement can be healthy. At least it's honest. This is something else entirely. This is someone who presents themselves as supportive while quietly undermining the foundations beneath you. They nod when you speak, encourage your plans, maybe even praise your ideas. Yet behind the scenes, they reshape circumstances so those ideas never reach their full potential. They might forget to pass along crucial information, misplace key details at exactly the wrong time, or casually plant seeds of doubt about your competence in conversations you're not part of. None of it is dramatic enough to cause immediate alarm, but taken together, it forms a pattern designed to slow you down while keeping their hands clean. In professional environments, this kind of hatred is especially effective. A colleague may volunteer to help on your project only to miss deadlines in ways that reflect poorly on you. They may subtly take credit for your contributions while framing your role as minor or supportive. They might highlight a small flaw in your work repeatedly, not because it matters, but because it shifts attention away from your strengths. In personal relationships, the tactic is just as calculated. A family member might casually mention your stress or impulsiveness to others, framing it as concern while quietly damaging how you're perceived. Over time, you begin to notice strange shifts. Invitations stop coming. Opportunities seem to disappear before you even hear about them. People treat you differently, more cautiously, without ever telling you why. This is not coincidence. It's the result of a quiet campaign built on half-truths and omissions. From a Stoic perspective, the danger here is not only the sabotage itself, but the emotional reaction it can provoke. Marcus Aurelius reminded us that while others may act with malice, the true harm comes from allowing their actions to disturb our inner state. That doesn't mean ignoring what's happening. It means refusing to let anger or panic pull you into their game. People who sabotage quietly thrive on chaos, confusion, and emotional outbursts because those reactions shift attention away from their behavior and onto yours. The Stoic response is observation paired with discipline. Instead of reacting to isolated incidents, you look for consistency. Is this truly a one-time mistake, or does it repeat in similar forms? Does this person benefit directly or indirectly when you are delayed, doubted, or diminished? When patterns become clear, the wise move is not confrontation fueled by emotion but strategic distance. You limit what you share. You document important exchanges. You strengthen relationships with those who know your character through long-term actions, not rumors. You make your work so visible and solid that whispers lose their power. Epictetus taught that we should focus only on what is within our control, our judgments, our actions, our choices. Trying to change the heart of someone who harbors resentment toward you is a waste of energy. Their hatred was not created by your behavior, and it will not be dissolved by your explanations. Some people are most comfortable when others remain below them. Your growth threatens the stories they tell themselves about their own limitations. Your success becomes an uncomfortable mirror, and rather than face it, they try to crack the glass. The Stoic does not chase approval or attempt to win over hidden enemies. He understands that his task is not to manage other people's emotions, but to guard his own integrity. By remaining calm, consistent, and focused, you deny them what they want most, your emotional reaction. Hatred feeds on disruption. It weakens when met with stillness. Recognizing this first sign is not about becoming suspicious of everyone around you. It's about becoming honest with yourself when something feels consistently off. Awareness pulls sabotage out of the shadows, and once it's seen clearly, it loses much of its power. But this is only the beginning, because some people don't just work against your success in silence. Some reveal their hatred in an even more unsettling way through the quiet pleasure they take in your pain. The second unmistakable sign of genuine hatred is revealed not in what someone says, but in how they respond when life turns against you. A person who truly wishes you well may not always know what to say, but their presence carries weight. Their concern feels steady, their questions aim to understand, and their energy seeks to ease your burden rather than study it. The person who harbors real hatred is different. When something goes wrong in your life, they feel something close to relief, even satisfaction, and no matter how carefully they try to hide it, the truth leaks through the cracks. Their sympathy sounds rehearsed. Their concern feels hollow. You sense it in their eyes, in the way they linger on details of your hardship, in the subtle eagerness beneath their calm tone. They ask questions not to help, but to collect information. They lean in not to support, but to savor the moment. This is not coincidence or misinterpretation. It is a pattern rooted in resentment. They are energized by your struggle because it restores a sense of balance in their own mind. Your pain reassures them that the world has corrected what they believe was an unfair advantage you held. You may notice that when you share good news, their response is brief, flat, or quickly redirected back to themselves. But when you share bad news, suddenly they have time, curiosity, and attention. They remember every detail. They bring it up later. They ask for updates that do nothing to improve your situation. On the surface, it looks like care. Underneath it is consumption. In social settings, this kind of person often becomes animated when discussing your setbacks, framing them as cautionary tales or lessons, subtly positioning themselves as wiser, more stable, or more deserving. On social media, they may ignore your achievements entirely, yet be quick to comment on your difficulties, cloaking their interest in supportive language while amplifying your vulnerability in public view. The psychological cost of this is heavy. Over time, you may find yourself sharing less, not because you've become private by choice, but because you've learned that your openness is met with indifference when you succeed and fascination when you suffer. This trains you to associate vulnerability with exposure rather than safety. It erodes trust. It shrinks your emotional world. And this is precisely the effect such a person desires. From a Stoic perspective, this is where discipline of perception becomes essential. Marcus Aurelius reminded us that we are not disturbed by events themselves, but by the judgments we attach to them. When someone reacts to your hardship with concealed pleasure, the instinctive response is anger or hurt. The Stoic response is clarity. You recognize the reaction as information, not as a verdict on your worth. Their enjoyment of your pain reveals their character, not your failure. And instead of confronting them emotionally, which only feeds their sense of importance, you quietly adjust your boundaries. You share less. You protect your inner life. You stop offering access to parts of yourself that can be exploited. This is not bitterness, it is self-respect. Epictetus taught that freedom begins when we understand what is and is not within our control. You cannot force someone to feel empathy. You cannot teach someone to celebrate your success if resentment has already taken root in them. But you can decide who gets a front row seat to your life. You can choose where your energy flows. You can deny them the satisfaction of seeing you diminished by their reactions. The Stoic does not demand fairness from the world. He demands alignment from himself. He does not waste time proving his value to those who secretly hope he fails. He redirects his attention to what strengthens his character, his purpose, and his peace. A single awkward reaction may mean nothing. Everyone has off days. But consistent interest in your pain paired with indifference toward your growth is a warning sign that should never be ignored. Patterns matter more than isolated moments. When you see this clearly, you stop internalizing their behavior and start interpreting it accurately. You no longer ask, "What did I do wrong?" but instead ask, "Why am I still giving access to someone who feeds on my setbacks?" This awareness is not meant to make you cold. It is meant to make you precise. And once you become precise with your energy, you are far harder to wound. But there is a darker escalation beyond this, because some people do not stop at quietly enjoying your pain. Some take the next step. They actively work to multiply it by turning the people around you against you, cutting away your support before you even realize what's happening. The third unmistakable sign of genuine hatred is when someone quietly works to turn others against you, not through open confrontation, but through whispers, concern-wrapped suggestions, and carefully chosen half-truths that reshape how people see you without ever giving you a chance to respond. This is one of the most dangerous tactics because it operates in the background while you remain unaware, trusting, and exposed. These individuals understand that direct attacks create resistance, but subtle doubt spreads easily and sticks. They position themselves as reasonable, caring, and trustworthy, the kind of person others feel safe confiding in, and once that role is secured, they begin controlling the narrative. It often starts with statements that sound harmless, even supportive, like, "I'm just worried about him. He seems under a lot of pressure lately," or "She's talented, but sometimes her judgment worries me." On the surface, these comments appear compassionate, but beneath them lies a seed of suspicion planted in someone else's mind. They don't accuse, they imply. They don't lie outright, they omit context. And because people naturally trust information delivered with apparent concern, the message lands without resistance. Over time, these small suggestions accumulate into a quiet shift in how others treat you. Conversations become guarded. Invitations stop coming. Decisions are made without you. You feel a change in the room but can't trace it to a single moment or statement. That's the brilliance of this tactic. It leaves no obvious crime scene, only a trail of altered perceptions. In workplaces, this often shows up as triangulation, where the person positions themselves as the go-between, filtering information so that messages pass through them before reaching you or others. They selectively relay details, emphasizing your mistakes while minimizing your corrections, highlighting your stress while ignoring your competence. In families or social circles, they become the sympathetic listener, the one everyone vents to, subtly steering opinions while appearing neutral. You may hear later that someone misunderstood you or that others felt concerned about your behavior, even though no one ever spoke to you directly. This creates isolation, and isolation weakens you. From a Stoic perspective, this is where clarity and restraint become your greatest defenses. Marcus Aurelius warned against surrendering your inner stability to the opinions of others, reminding us that our worth is not determined by rumors or second-hand judgments. The Stoic does not chase every whisper or attempt to correct every false impression, because that only deepens the manipulator's power by keeping you reactive. Instead, the Stoic focuses on directness and consistency. You maintain open, honest communication with those who matter. If someone grows distant, you address it calmly, face to face, without accusation or drama. You refuse to allow a third party to define your relationships. At the same time, you become more selective with what you share and with whom. You stop giving sensitive information to someone who has proven they cannot be trusted with it. You understand that not everyone deserves access to your inner life. Epictetus taught that we should concern ourselves only with what is within our control, and while you cannot stop someone from speaking about you, you can control the integrity of your actions and the steadiness of your character. Over time, truth expressed through consistent behavior speaks louder than whispers ever can. People who know you well will sense the dissonance between the narrative being spread and the reality they experience with you. The key is patience. Sabotage through reputation relies on your emotional reaction. on panic defensiveness or angry confrontation that makes the lies appear justified. By remaining composed, by continuing to act with clarity and fairness, you allow the manipulator to eventually reveal themselves through inconsistency and overreach. This does not mean you remain passive. It means you respond strategically rather than emotionally. You document, you clarify when necessary, and you build relationships based on direct trust rather than assumed loyalty. The hardest truth to accept here is that some people derive power not from your failure alone, but from your isolation. They want you doubting your allies, questioning your standing, and shrinking your presence. Once you see this pattern, you stop internalizing the confusion and start interpreting it accurately. You realize that sudden shifts in how others treat you are signals to investigate calmly, not reasons to collapse inward. And when you reclaim direct communication and reduce the manipulator's influence, you weaken their strategy at its core. But there is an even more unsettling evolution of this behavior, one that goes beyond undermining your relationships and moves into imitation mixed with rivalry, where hatred disguises itself as admiration while quietly attempting to erase your identity altogether. The fourth sign of genuine hatred is far more unsettling than open rivalry because it wears the mask of admiration while carrying the intent of erasure. This is when someone begins copying you while simultaneously trying to outdo you, not as healthy competition, but as a way to replace you. At first, it may feel flattering. They adopt similar habits, echo your ideas, mirror your style, or suddenly take interest in the same paths you walk. You might tell yourself they're inspired, that imitation is a form of respect. But over time, something feels off. Their attention isn't creative, it's invasive. They don't build on what you do, they replicate it, strip it of context, and then race to present it as superior. This behavior is driven by a deep insecurity rooted in comparison. You represent something they want but don't know how to become on their own. So instead of developing their own identity, they attempt to overwrite yours. They study you closely not to learn but to compete from inside your shadow. In professional settings, this shows up when someone lifts your ideas almost verbatim, changes a few surface details, and presents them as their own, often rushing to showcase them before you have the chance. In personal life, it appears when someone adopts your interests, your routines, even your language, then subtly positions themselves as more committed, more authentic, more deserving of recognition. The goal isn't excellence, it's displacement. What makes this sign especially corrosive is that it's often paired with quiet invalidation. While copying you, they may also downplay your originality, question your competence, or accuse you of copying them instead. This reversal creates confusion and self-doubt, pulling you into a mental loop where you feel the need to defend your identity. That's the trap. The more you engage in comparison, the more energy you feed into their obsession. Stoic philosophy offers a clean escape from this dynamic. Epictetus reminded us that if you want to be free, you must stop handing over control of your inner state to external validation. The Stoic understands that identity is not proven through competition, but through consistency of character. Someone can imitate your actions, but they cannot replicate your inner discipline, your values, or the quiet integrity that shaped those actions in the first place. The moment you stop measuring yourself against them, their entire strategy begins to collapse. Instead of competing harder or trying to reclaim credit publicly, the Stoic response is detachment with clarity. You continue refining your craft, deepening your skills, and living according to your principles without explaining yourself. You let your work speak over time, knowing that imitation without substance eventually reveals itself as hollow. Healthy inspiration creates growth and mutual respect. Malicious imitation creates tension, anxiety, and a constant sense of being watched. Pay attention to how you feel. Genuine admiration feels energizing. This kind of rivalry feels draining and invasive. That feeling is information. The longer you allow yourself to be pulled into silent competition, the more of your focus they steal. The Stoic refuses that theft. You step out of the comparison entirely and reclaim your attention. You remember that your path is not a race against them, but a responsibility to yourself. And when you do this, something important happens. Their copying loses purpose. Their need to outshine you starves without your participation. You remain grounded in who you are, while they remain trapped, chasing a reflection that will never satisfy them. But even this obsessive rivalry is not the final form of hatred. There is one last sign, quieter than all the others, yet more dangerous because it works directly on your inner state. It doesn't attack your reputation or your ideas. It attacks your energy, your clarity, and your sense of self. And it reveals itself not in what they do, but in how you feel after every interaction with them. The fifth and final sign of genuine hatred is the one most people ignore the longest because it doesn't announce itself through conflict, gossip, or obvious hostility. It reveals itself quietly in how you feel after every interaction. Every conversation leaves you depleted, not confused in a dramatic way, not angry in an obvious way, but subtly drained, smaller and less clear than you were before. This isn't coincidence. This is pattern. And patterns are where truth lives. When someone harbors real hatred toward you, their presence alone becomes corrosive. Even when they say the right things, even when they appear calm or polite, something in the exchange feels off. You walk away replaying the conversation, questioning your words, wondering why your chest feels tight or your mind feels restless. Nothing explosive happened, yet something was taken from you. That is not normal human friction. That is psychological erosion. These people specialize in micro-cuts to your sense of self, a backhanded compliment delivered with a smile, a subtle reminder of an old mistake framed as humor, a tone that suggests superiority without ever saying it outright. Each remark is small enough to deny, but sharp enough to register. Over time, you begin to adjust yourself around them. You choose words more carefully. You avoid certain topics. You hold back parts of yourself instinctively. This is not growth. This is self-protection. And when self-protection becomes constant, it turns into exhaustion. The most dangerous part is that this dynamic often makes you doubt yourself rather than them. You start asking, am I too sensitive? Am I reading into things? Am I imagining this? That self-doubt is not accidental. It is the environment they cultivate. Marcus Aurelius warned that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. When you are repeatedly exposed to someone who undermines you, subtly, your internal dialogue begins to shift. You second-guess your competence. You question your worth. You lose trust in your own perception. That is how hatred works at its most refined level. It does not seek to destroy you loudly. It seeks to rewrite you quietly. The Stoic response to this is not confrontation, and it is not endurance. It is clarity followed by distance. Stoicism does not teach you to tolerate poison. It teaches you to recognize it and stop ingesting it. Epictetus was clear that freedom begins where external influence ends. If someone consistently leaves you feeling worse, smaller, or less grounded, that information is enough. You do not need proof. You do not need an admission. You do not need validation from others. Effects matter more than intentions. A single bad day with someone means nothing. A consistent pattern means everything. This final sign ties all the others together. The sabotage, the joy in your suffering, the manipulation of others, the obsessive rivalry, all of it leads here. The end goal of genuine hatred is not just your failure, but your internal destabilization. Once you are tired, uncertain, and disconnected from your own instincts, you are easier to influence, easier to undermine, and easier to control. That is why protecting your energy is not selfish, it is strategic. The Stoic understands that peace is not passive, peace is defended. You defend it by choosing where your attention goes, who gets access to you, and which environments you allow to shape your inner world. Walking away from someone who drains you is not weakness. It is discipline. It is self-respect in action. You do not owe anyone continued access to your mind, your time, or your emotional space, especially when that access is being used against you. Genuine hatred is rarely dramatic. It is methodical, patient, and quiet. And once you learn to see it, you are no longer obligated to pretend it isn't there. Stoicism teaches that while you cannot control the malice in another person's heart, you can always control the doors you leave open. Some people smile only to get closer to the knife. Some listen only to learn where to strike. Your responsibility is not to fix them, expose them, or defeat them. Your responsibility is to remain intact, to remain clear, to remain sovereign over your inner world. When you do that, their hatred loses its power, not because they change, but because you do. You stop feeding what feeds on you. You stop explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. You stop shrinking to keep the peace. And in that moment, something important happens. You are no longer a target. You are no longer available. You become grounded, steady, and difficult to disturb. That is the kind of strength the Stoics respected most. Not dominance over others, but mastery over oneself. If you have recognized these signs in someone in your life, do not rush. Do not panic. Simply begin to withdraw your energy with intention. Strengthen your boundaries. Clarify your values. Choose peace over poison, clarity over chaos, and self-respect over familiarity. Hatred cannot survive where it is not fed. And when you stop feeding it, you reclaim something far more valuable than revenge or validation. You reclaim yourself.